All right, welcome to another deep dive
Yeah,
into some really fascinating philosophical territory.
absolutely.
Today, we're going to be looking at something that, well, on the surface, it might seem like it belongs more in like a literature class
Right.
than, a philosophy seminar.
Yeah.
But I think you'll see why it's actually a really, really rich area for philosophical inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
So, the topic is fiction.
Right.
And we're going to be basing our discussion today on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on fiction.
Sounds good.
So, as philosophers, I think we're always kind of drawn to the fundamental questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
The big, like, what is knowledge? What is truth? What is existence? But then you might think, well, what does that have to do with made-up stories
Right.
with fiction?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're going to try to unpack today.
I think that's a great question to start with.
Yeah.
Because, at first glance,
Right.
fiction might seem like, oh, that's just entertainment. It's just stories.
Right.
But when you really start to think about it philosophically,
Yeah.
it raises some really, really profound questions.
Okay, like what?
Well, let's just take, for example, the very idea of representation. Like, how do we even understand
Right.
how these fictional worlds
Okay.
and fictional characters relate to our own world?
Yeah, that's a good one.
And then, what kind of truth can we find in a story that we know is made up?
Right.
And then, what does it say about existence itself?
Okay.
That we can be so moved by things that don't actually exist.
Yeah.
So these are the kinds of questions that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries, really.
Yeah. And I mean, it is kind of a very human thing to tell
Absolutely.
stories.
Absolutely.
I mean, going back to, sitting around campfires, we tell each other stories, we make things up.
Right.
And the philosophers were onto this a long time ago.
Yeah. I mean, even if you go all the way back to Plato and Aristotle,
Yeah.
they were already thinking about fiction in
Yeah.
relation to things like mimesis,
Right.
which is just a fancy word for representation,
Okay.
and how it relates to truth. So
Right.
it's been a philosophical topic for a long, long time.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, when you think about how philosophers usually deal with truth,
Right.
it's in this very rigorous, almost like scientific way.
Yeah, like trying to correspond to the real world,
Right.
Trying to get things exactly right.
Exactly.
But fiction's different.
Yeah.
It's a different mode of representation. It's
Right.
not bound by the same rules.
So it's still representation, but
It is, yeah. It's still representing something,
but necessarily.
but it doesn't have to stick to,
Yeah.
the actual world.
And in fact, it often deals with things that don't even exist.
Yeah.
You mentioned Sherlock Holmes before.
Right.
Sherlock Holmes never existed.
Yeah, but we can still talk about him. We
Yeah.
can still, discuss
Yeah.
his personality, his cases, his...
Yeah, like what kind of person he was.
Exactly.
Even though he was never a real person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it goes even further than that. I mean,
Okay.
think about, Tolkien's Middle Earth.
Yeah.
You've got entire races
Yeah.
of beings that don't exist.
Right.
Hobbits, elves, dwarves.
Yeah.
These are things that don't have any counterpart in reality.
Yeah.
But we can still talk about them. We can still think about them.
Right.
We can still be moved by them. And that raises, I think, a really fundamental
Yeah.
ontological question.
Yeah.
What are we doing when we
Yeah.
talked about these non-existent things?
Right.
What kind of status do they have,
Yeah, if any.
if any? Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And I think that leads us nicely into its idea of fictionalism,
Yeah.
which
So fictionalism, it's a kind of a recent philosophical movement,
okay.
and you find it in a lot of different areas of philosophy.
Like, for example.
For example, the philosophy of mathematics or ethics. But the basic idea is that we should treat certain claims as if they were fictional, even though
they're not necessarily.
they might not be fictional.
Yeah.
So, for example, a mathematical fictionalist might say
Okay.
that we should treat statements about numbers in the same way that we treat statements about Sherlock Holmes. So, the statement, Sherlock Holmes was a brilliant detective,
Right.
we can understand that statement. We can see how it functions within the stories.
Right.
We don't have to believe that there's actually some guy named Sherlock Holmes running around London.
Right.
Similarly, the mathematical fictionalist would say that we can understand mathematical statements, we can use them, they can be useful,
Yeah.
But we don't have to believe
right.
that they're actually referring to some
weird
platonic realm of numbers out there.
Yeah, so it's kind of like we're playing a game.
In a way, yeah.
Right, where we're pretending that these things are real.
It's like a useful fiction. Right. You know, it helps us do things. It helps us understand things. Yeah. But we don't have to take it literally.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And I think it makes it really clear why we need to understand what fiction is.
Right, exactly.
If we're going to treat other things like as if they were fiction.
We need to know what that even means.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what is fiction?
Right, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we all have a sort of intuitive sense of what fiction is.
Yeah, like you could usually point to something and say, that's fiction, that's not.
Yeah.
But if you try to actually define it, it gets really tricky.
Okay.
So one way to start might be to say, well, fiction is writing that misrepresents the world. It's not telling the truth.
Right.
But it's not lying.
It's not trying to deceive you.
Right, right.
The author isn't trying to trick you.
Yeah, it's like we're all in on the game.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But even that definition has problems.
Okay, like what?
Well, first of all, fiction isn't always written.
Right.
I mean, you have movies, you have plays.
Right. Oral storytelling.
Yeah. Video games, all sorts of things.
Right. So it's not just writing.
Right. And also, that definition's too broad.
Okay.
Because there are lots of things that misrepresent the world that we wouldn't call fiction.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, think about satire or irony. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, sometimes people will say things ironically or satirically where they're obviously not telling the truth.
Right.
But they're not writing fiction.
Yeah, they're making a point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not that simple.
So it's tougher than it looks.
It is, yeah. And this difficulty in defining fiction actually leads to some of the most interesting philosophical problems about fiction.
Right, like what?
Well, one of the biggest ones is the problem of truth in fiction. So how can a sentence like Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street?
Right.
How can that be true if Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist?
Right.
Like for a philosopher who's thinking about truth in terms of, you know, correspondence to reality.
Right. That's a problem.
That's a huge problem. Yeah. Like how can a sentence about something that doesn't exist be true?
Yeah.
So one way that philosophers have tried to deal with this is to say that, well, when we say something like, Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street.
Right.
What we're really saying is, according to the Holmes stories, Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street.
Okay, so we're kind of adding...
It's like an implicit prefix.
Right, an implicit prefix. Okay.
So we're not saying that it's true in the real world. Right. We're saying that it's true within
the story.
Within the story.
Right.
But even then, that raises the question of, well, what makes that prefix sentence true?
Right.
Like, what are the truth conditions for statements about fictional worlds?
Yeah, because it's not like it's true in reality.
It's not like we can go check and see if Sherlock Holmes really lived there. Yeah. So it's a tricky issue.
It's a really tricky issue.
Yeah.
And then there's another one that I find really fascinating.
Yeah.
Which is the emotional responses to fiction.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, we've all had this experience where we read a book or we watch a movie and we get really invested in the characters. Mm. You know, we feel sad when something bad happens to them.
Right.
We feel happy when they succeed.
Totally.
You know, like classic example, Anna Karenina.
Yeah.
You know, it's a tragedy and people, you know, are moved by it.
They feel her pain.
Right.
Yeah.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
We know she's not real.
Exactly.
So how is it that we can have these genuine emotional responses to things that we know don't exist?
That's what philosophers call the paradox of fiction. And it's like, it's paradoxical because our emotions are usually directed at things that we believe to be real and to be happening.
Yeah.
But with fiction, we know it's not real.
Yeah.
But we still feel these emotions.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
It's a puzzle.
Yeah, it's a real puzzle.
Yeah.
And then there's this other thing when we talk about fiction. We say things like, you know, many readers pity Anna Karenina or Conan Doyle created Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
And these statements, they seem true.
They do.
Right?
Yeah.
Like those are true statements.
It seems like it.
Yeah. But then again, Anna Karenina doesn't exist.
Right.
So what are we really saying?
Yeah, exactly.
When we make these statements?
Yeah.
What are we referring to?
And what are we committed to when we talk about fiction?
Yeah.
Because it seems like we're talking about these characters as if they're real, but we know they're not.
Yeah, so that's another kind of puzzle.
It's another puzzle, yeah. So given all these puzzles, philosophers have come up with a whole bunch of different approaches to try to define fiction.
All right, so let's go through some of those.
Yeah.
What's one approach?
So one approach is to focus on the language of fiction. Okay. Like, what are the actual words?
And sentences that make up a fictional work.
Okay.
So one philosopher, Nelson Goodman, he said that fiction is basically just false statements.
Okay.
Like it's writing that's not true.
Right, but as we said before, that's a little too broad.
It is, yeah. Because you could have a history textbook that has some mistakes in it.
Right.
And we wouldn't call that fiction.
Right, yeah, so that doesn't quite work.
Right. Another philosopher, Dort Cohn, she came up with this idea of literary non-referential narrative.
Okay.
Which basically means that fiction is a kind of storytelling that doesn't refer to the real world.
Okay, but again, that doesn't always work.
Right, because you have things like historical fiction, which is clearly referring to
real events.
Real events and real people.
Yeah.
And then there have been attempts to find like specific stylistic features that are unique to fiction.
Okay.
But that hasn't really worked either.
Because like you can find things like free indirect discourse.
Right.
Which is a kind of a literary technique.
Yeah.
You can find that in both fiction and nonfiction.
Okay, so the language itself isn't enough to define fiction.
It doesn't seem to be.
Okay.
So then some philosophers have said, well, maybe we should focus on the author.
Okay.
So, like, what is the author doing when they create a work of fiction?
Okay.
One philosopher, Harry Deutsch,
he
said that fiction is basically just making up stories. Like, it's the author using their imagination to create a world and to populate it with characters.
Right, so it's all about the author's intention.
Yeah. But then there are problems with that too, because like, what about cases where someone writes something that they claim is true, but it turns out to be made up? Like, you know those fake memoirs?
Right, yeah.
Deutsch would say, well, those are still fiction because the author made them up.
Right.
But, you know, most people would say, no, those are lies. They're not fiction.
They're deception.
They're deception, yeah. So it's not just about the author making things up. It's also about how they present it.
Right, their intention.
Their intention, yeah.
Yeah.
So then another approach is to focus on the idea of pretense.
Okay.
So philosophers like John Searle have said that when an author writes fiction, they're not really asserting anything. They're pretending to assert things.
Okay.
So, like, when Conan Doyle writes Sherlock Holmes lived at 2221B Baker Street, he's not actually claiming that that's true.
Okay.
He's pretending to claim it.
Right, as part of the game.
As part of the game, yeah.
Yeah.
But there are problems with that view, too, because, like, sometimes authors of fiction do seem to be making serious assertions.
Yeah, like they're actually trying to say something.
Yeah, like they're using the fiction to express their own views.
Yeah.
And also, we pretend in lots of other contexts that aren't fiction.
Yeah, like we talked about irony before.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So pretense is part of it, but it's not the whole story.
It's not the whole story,
Yeah.
Okay, so what other approaches are there?
So another approach is to focus on the reader.
Okay.
So, like, what is the reader doing when they engage with a work of fiction?
Okay.
One of the most famous theories of this kind
Okay.
is Kendall Walton's theory of make-believe.
Okay.
So Walton says that fiction is basically a prop in a game of make-believe.
Okay.
So the author creates this fictional world.
Right.
And then the reader uses their imagination to enter that world and to play along.
Okay, so it's kind of like we're all participating in this
shared
imagination game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Walton says that what makes something true in a fictional world is just that it's part of the game.
Okay.
Like, if everyone's pretending that Sherlock Holmes lives at 221B Baker Street, then that's what makes it true in that fictional world.
So it doesn't have to connect to reality.
Right. It's just about the rules of the game.
Right.
But this view has some problems, too.
Okay, like what?
Well, for one thing,
yeah,
it seems to make a lot of things count as fiction that we wouldn't normally think of as fiction.
Okay, give me an example.
Like, Imagine a really, really vivid history book. It could be so well written that it really draws you in, and you start to feel like you're there.
Yeah.
You're using your imagination to experience these events.
Right.
So according to Walton's view, that could count as fiction, even though it's about real events.
Yeah. So it's a little too broad again.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
So then another approach is to combine the author's intentions with the reader's response.
Okay.
So these are called speech act theories.
Okay.
And one of the most well-known of these is Greg Curry's theory of fictive utterance.
Okay.
So Curry says that when an author writes fiction, they're performing a special kind of speech act.
Okay.
He calls it a fictive utterance.
Okay.
And what makes it a fictive utterance is that the author intends the reader to make believe the content of the work.
Okay.
And the reader recognizes that intention.
Okay.
So it's a kind of a shared understanding.
Okay, so it's like a kind of implicit contract?
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
Okay.
But Curry also says that if a fictional work happens to contain some true statements, that's just accidental.
Right.
It's not essential to its being fiction.
Okay.
But again, this view has some problems.
Yeah, I mean, like we said before, there's lots of fiction that intentionally uses true statements.
Yeah, right, like historical fiction.
Right, yeah.
So there's a lot of debate about how to deal with those cases.
Okay, so it sounds like we've got all these different approaches.
I do.
And they all have their own strengths and weaknesses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And some philosophers have even suggested that maybe we should just give up on trying to define fiction.
Really?
Yeah, like maybe it's just too messy. Maybe there's no single definition that will capture all the cases.
Okay, so if we can't define it, then what do we do?
Well, some philosophers have said that maybe instead of trying to define it, we should just focus on how we actually use the word.
Yeah.
Like, what are the different ways that we talk about fiction?
Okay.
What are the different functions that it serves?
Okay.
And maybe that will give us a better understanding of what fiction is.
Okay, so it's more about like how it works in practice.
Yeah, exactly.
Rather than trying to come up with some abstract definition.
Yeah, like maybe we should just accept that there are borderline cases and that the boundaries of fiction are fuzzy.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So even if we can't agree on a single definition of fiction, there's still a lot we can talk about.
Absolutely.
When it comes to truth in fiction.
Yeah.
Because, as we've seen, even though fictional worlds are made up, they still have their own internal logic and their own set of truths.
Totally.
So how do we make sense of that?
Right. That's a great question.
Yeah.
And one way to start is to think about this idea of the in the story prefix.
Okay, we talked about that before.
Yeah. So, like, when we say Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street, what we're really saying is in the story, Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street. So we're not saying it's true in the real world. We're saying it's true within the story.
Within the story. But how do we know what's true within the story?
Right. That's the tricky part.
Yeah.
And it's not just about what the author explicitly tells us, because sometimes we have to infer things. Sometimes the narrator is unreliable.
Right.
So we have to figure out what's really going on.
Yeah.
And then there's the issue of background knowledge, like what things from the real world do we automatically import into the fictional world?
Right. Because we can't just assume that everything that's true in reality is also true in the story.
Yeah. So, like, if a story is set in London, do we assume that Big Ben is there?
Yeah.
Do we assume that the Queen of England exists?
Right.
It depends on the story.
It depends on the story.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there are a lot of tricky issues here.
Okay, so how have philosophers tried to deal with this?
Well, one of the most famous approaches is David Lewis's possible worlds approach.
Okay.
So Lewis was a philosopher who was really interested in the idea of possible worlds.
Right.
So possible worlds are basically just ways that things could have been.
Okay.
Like, there's the actual world, which is the way things are.
Right.
And then there are all these other possible worlds, which are ways that things could have been, but aren't.
Right. Like alternate realities.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
Okay.
And Lewis said that when we talk about truth in fiction, what we're really doing